When dealing with a falsehood, you're faced with two options. You can accept it or you can reject it. The basis upon which we take one of these actions is a product of our critical thinking capabilities and a desire to know what is true instead of confirming our bias. A lie can travel halfway around the world while the truth is still putting on its shoes. On Brainstorm, we choose the hard truths over the comforting lies. Reason, compassion, skepticism. This is the Brainstorm Podcast.
Hi, and welcome to the Brainstorm Podcast Skeptic Studio, the interview show from Brainstorm where we talk to a variety of folks with the intent to spread critical thinking, compassion, and skepticism. As regular listeners will know, we're taking the summer off from our panel sessions in the studio. Instead, I'm going to be putting out one interview each week. I wanted to continue putting out content so that listeners don't forget about us, but I also had a number of people I wanted to talk to for one reason or another who we just couldn't fit into the live show schedule. This series of interviews gives me that chance. The first in this series is an interview with Brian Dunning. Brian is the host of the long-running skeptical podcast, Skeptoid. He also has several other projects on the go, one of which is a new book, Conspiracies, Declassified. I talked to Brian for a little while about the book, about Skeptoid, and about some of the conspiracies he covers in it. This interview is a bit short because I'm still getting into the swing of things again. I kind of fell off of doing the one-on-one interviews, but I think that it was still a good conversation, and in a time when so many skeptics are spending all their time attacking leftist politics and social justice, it's nice to see someone who's working on a bit of good old-fashioned educational skepticism. With that, I hope you enjoy the chat. But first, a quick promo.
Hey everybody, we're the Utah Outcasts, and we want you to listen to our show.
We're a rowdy bunch of super liberal atheists that reside in the state of Utah, who bring you current events and featured content on a semi-weekly basis.
Whether it's us poking fun at the religious right or ranting at the world in which we all reside, we want to borrow your ears for about an hour twice a week.
Hey, and don't forget to tell them the best part about it.
Oh yeah!
The show's free for all.
It is indeed, so if you like free, we're available through iTunes, Overcast, iHeartRadio, Stitcher, Spreaker, Google Play, Patreon, and even in full HD video via YouTube. Give us a listen. You won't be sorry.
Welcome to the Brainstorm Podcast Skeptic Studio. My guest today is Brian Dunning, host of Skeptoid. How's it going, Brian?
It's going great. Thank you for having me on.
Absolutely. You are one of the first people that I started listening to when I got introduced to skepticism. So it's kind of cool to have you on my own show.
Oh, wow. It's kind of cool to hear that kind of thing. I get it a lot. I've been doing this a long time, so it's really fun. I consider myself very fortunate that I get to do this for a living.
Yeah, no kidding. That is like the dream almost, right?
Yeah, for me it was for a long time.
So I guess just for listeners who might not know, what is your background? How did you get into skepticism, maybe?
Yeah. So when I was a kid, like so many other people who work in science writing, science journalism, I got into it just from a great interest in strange things when I was a kid. You know, I was a science fiction fan, and I read all the books on UFOs and Bigfoots and ghosts and aliens and everything, and believed it all completely, wholeheartedly. But it just developed a real fascination for kind of the genre. And later I studied computer science in school and also writing for film and television.
Okay.
And it's hard to combine those two things into a real career. Certainly way back then it was. But then kind of the early 2000s, podcasts appeared, kind of became a thing. And there's an outlet that's both creative and lets you choose whatever kind of content you want. So right. I thought, hey, a science podcast is the kind of thing that I want to do. And just because I had this whole great giant background in all of these kind of urban legend type things, I decided to make a show about the science behind urban legends. So brought out the first episodes in October 2006. Was very fortunate that it turned out to be a show that seemed to appeal to a lot of people. It got pretty popular pretty quickly. And of course, back in those days in 2006, it was a lot easier to get a start as a podcaster. There were, a tiny fraction of the podcasts out then as there are now.
Not quite the same competition.
Yeah, it was pretty easy to be a big fish in a small pond back then. So that worked out well for me. So after a couple of years, I began taking donations because it was taking so much time away from. I was working as a software consultant at the time.
Oh yeah,
and then by I think 2008 I incorporated. 2010 it became my full-time job, and then 2012 we converted it to a nonprofit because the most uptake was from educators. It was being used in schools, things like that, and we had major donors wanting to come on board and be involved.
That's super cool.
Yeah, it's been going great. There's a wonderful board of directors, a big, huge board of advisors. Got several employees now, and it's just going like gangbusters, and it's a lot of fun. I do the podcast. I do a documentary film each year. 2017 was Principles of Curiosity, which is kind of like a 40-minute movie version of Skeptoid.
Neat.
And that's available for free online at principlesofcuriosity.com. And right now we're in pre-production on a theatrical documentary about scientists who have been misrepresented on television documentaries, had their words edited out of context, that kind of thing. And that's called Science Friction. And that's currently being crowdfunded at sciencefriction.tv. And there's a trailer there where people can watch and see what it's going to be about.
That's
so there.
That's cool. That's a lot of stuff.
It's a lot of stuff, yeah.
I suppose when you've been doing it as long as you have, the amount of stuff that you've covered, do you ever start repeating yourself?
No. People will often email, hey, do an episode on this. I say, yeah, I did that 9 years ago. It's like, I think, well, gee, maybe it is due for an update, but I still have this folder of 200-300 ideas that I haven't done yet.
Right. So. Yeah. It's not like the pseudoscience or misinformation ever stops.
It never stops. No. And I avoid current events. I don't do, whatever Gwyneth Paltrow is promoting this week, right. or something that, a conspiracy theory that's on TV now, because I like my episodes to be timeless. I like them to be relevant so someone can listen to it 5 years from now. So I kind of wait for urban legends to have been around for a while and proven to have some long life, that they've grown some legs. And then they make good topics for my show.
For sure. That's actually a pretty good way of doing it. We tend to handle current events and like whatever pseudoscience or woo is in the news right now. And if I don't get the episode out fast enough, then it almost sometimes isn't a thing anymore by the time I get it out.
Yeah, very much. Yeah. And that's, I think that's what most shows tend to focus on, more current events, which makes the episode more timely. And so I just kind of go for a little bit of a different audience. So, I like to think that the shows are complementary and not in competition with one another.
Yeah, that makes sense. So I guess moving on a little bit, you have a book coming out or is out?
Yes, came out on June 5th. So about a year or two ago, Simon & Schuster, the publisher, gave me a call and said, hey, we're doing this series of 50 of this, 50 of that, and we want to do a book on 50 conspiracy theories. Do you want to write it? So I said, okay.
Nice. 50 is quite a bit.
50 is quite a bit. But then at the other hand, they said, well, okay, for first step, can you give us 50 conspiracy theories? Can you give us a list of 50 of them? And I said, yeah, I think I can do that. So I go to my content management database where I have all my episodes and everything, and I just search for the category conspiracy theories, do a dump, and I got something like 200 that I'd already done shows on. So it is an embarrassment of riches.
Yeah. Then it's just a matter of picking the right ones, I guess.
And of course, they came up with 2 or 3 that I hadn't done an episode on. Like,
okay.
Let's see, they did. They had Biggie and Tupac,
Oh, yeah.
and Elvis. Elvis still being alive. I had not done episodes on either of those. I have now.
Cool. Yeah, no, right on. What are some of the more popular conspiracy theories?
Of course, there's 9/11 truth,
Right.
and there's Holocaust denial, and there's the Apollo moon landings were a hoax, and there's JFK. All of these are the ones people think of first. And
Right, yeah.
of course, those are in the book. I tend to be more interested in the ones that are, I don't want to say obscure, because none of the ones in the book are obscure, but the ones that people aren't as familiar with, because there's a much greater opportunity to bring new information to people that they hadn't heard before, and to be a little bit more engaging, as compared to treading over the same territory that everyone's already heard 100 times.
Yeah, I suppose when you cover 9/11, it's pretty hard to recover the same thing. Like, it's been covered so much.
Yeah. So, I have things like Hearst and hemp. William Randolph Hearst was responsible for killing the hemp/marijuana industry. Now, a lot of people may have heard that or heard it in passing, but the actual truth behind what actually happened and why that's complete BS is something that very few people have been exposed to, I think. So,
Yeah, I think I've actually listened to the episode of Skeptoid on that one.
you may have. Yeah. And then there's there's the flat earth theory, which we hear about today a lot, but you're hearing a very different version of the flat earth theory than actually was believed in the 18th, 19th, early 20th centuries.
Yeah.
It's a completely different flat earth theory that has nothing to do with kind of today's version, which is more, associated with conspiracy theories and alternative science and government suppression and all this stuff. Whereas the actual history of the legend comes from biblical literalists who were trying to promote, kind of a radical Christian fundamentalism. And the whole history of how that came about and why it happened is something that's quite fascinating. And of course, where it intersects with the Apollo moon landing was a hoax. That's a really fascinating intersection that I think a lot of people aren't aware of. So,
because the moon doesn't exist, right?
That's right.
Yeah, I actually really look forward to reading it. Is it going to be available on Amazon?
It is. It's available on Amazon, Barnes & Noble. I just saw this morning it's available as an ebook on the Microsoft Store. In fact, yesterday was a lot of fun because on Twitter, all sorts of people were posting pictures of themselves holding the book that just showed up in their Amazon their Amazon shipment. So that was a lot of fun seeing.
That's awesome. So I guess in relation to the book, like how long did you say it's been a project?
Let's see. It took just about a year, and a lot of that was waiting for the editors to get back. They came to me with it initially had a pretty compressed time frame, and I said, look, the only way that I can do this is, fortunately I've got a lot of source material already. I've done episodes on all of these shows. And they said, oh, well, we can't have you copy and pasting. I said, no, I'm not copying and pasting anything. I mean, the book is formatted very differently from the podcast episodes.
Right.
But it did allow me to basically write a chapter a day, which without the ability to do that, there's no way I could have squeezed a 50-chapter book in with just my regular. I mean, you already heard me talk about all the projects I'm working on all the time.
For sure, yeah.
It was a lot of late nights and compressed time frames of, yeah.
Yeah, I suppose having that, at least the information already readily available makes it like 100 times easier to write about it.
Because it reduced the need for research. I had to write everything, but I had all the research already done, and that's really what made it achievable.
So did you find the act of actually writing difficult? Or do you find writing it just comes naturally to you, or do you find it easy?
It comes very natural to me. It's a lot of fun. Like I say, I studied that in college way back when. I spent about 6 years trying to exist as a screenwriter in Hollywood in my 20s.
Nice.
In fact, I was just cleaning out my office a couple of days ago, and I came across a box of screenplays. There must have been 15 or 20 that I did not even remember.
Jeez.
So I really enjoy the writing aspect of what I do. That's one of the things I consider myself most fortunate about.
Yeah, I do a little bit of script writing for my show, and it's like I'm not terribly strong as a writer. So it's sometimes I read it back and I go, somebody else should be doing this.
Some people are better speakers than writers, and I'm a better writer than a speaker.
Well, that helps with writing a book, I suppose.
It does.
I almost want to go back to the Tupac and Biggie conspiracy. I remember people talking about that back when Tupac and Biggie died. And even there's a running joke among some people that they're on an island somewhere with Elvis.
Could be. Nothing would surprise me after all these years.
Did you find anything with that was I don't know, surprising in any way?
Not really. The thing with something like that is I'm not going to make a new discovery that no other researcher has come up with. Okay, I have no illusions about that. So this is more of a straight reporting type of chapter where you're essentially just going back and seeing what investigative journalists have written about it before, and then just kind of reformulating that, reformatting that into our structure for the way these book chapters work.
Right.
And it's not something that I had really ever paid any attention to personally, so it was all new for me.
Oh yeah.
And what it comes down to basically is it was just rival gang activity, and the people who are involved in that simply are not going to share what happened with the police. They're not going to turn over their enemies to the cops any more than they're going to turn over their friends.
Right.
So the law enforcement is just kind of in over its head, thinking they're ever going to solve this one. And that's basically the conclusion.
Yeah, that makes the most sense to me. I know my ex-wife was a big Tupac fan back in the 90s, so we would spend a lot of time discussing the Tupac, Biggie, and Death Row Records and all that stuff. So
yeah. I remember that it does seem that the early media made more of this alleged East Coast, West Coast rap rivalry sort of, than there actually was. I mean, most of these guys were pretty much bi-coastal anyway.
Yeah.
Certainly the gangs that they're affiliated with, are more geographically oriented, but there wasn't really an East Coast, West Coast hip hop rivalry the way that it was made out. That's kind of about the closest thing I could say to something that surprised me or something that may surprise most readers.
Yeah, I remember a buddy of mine, he actually compared a lot of that rap rivalry to professional wrestling in the the kind of back and forth. It's all acting. They're really not. And I mean, I don't know if it was quite that fake, but I guess it's hard to say.
Yeah, I mean, I think the promoters, if you will, and we're in the wrestling, they have the promoters, and in a case like this, you had the journalists, especially the tabloid journalists. We're certainly filling that role of promoters and acting. I think that's not a half bad analogy at all.
Yeah.
When we were having our first conversations with the publisher, one of the first things that they all wanted to know, as all of their editors are sitting around the table talking about it, they said, "Well, what are the conspiracy theories that were proven true?"
Oh yeah.
And I laughed and said, that's the most common question that I always get, that I always have gotten and probably always will get. So I promised them, yes, we will. The last section in the book, I think it's divided into 5 or 6 sections. The last section in the book is conspiracy theories that turned out to be true. And I've got 6 of them in there listed, and I discuss each one, and was it really a conspiracy theory that turned out to be true? And I will leave it to the readers of the book. I won't spoil it for you, because they're all good ones.
Yeah, you get to... I think I've heard you talk about some conspiracies that may have been true on Skeptoid before. It's something
I did an episode on that too. Mm-hmm.
Yeah, it seems it's a topic that is, I don't know, it's very interesting to a lot of people because they really want conspiracies to be true.
Well, and everyone who has a belief in a conspiracy theory believes that theirs turned out to be proven true.
Right. Yeah. Yeah, that's right.
So, yeah, that's a topic that's always going to ruffle some feathers and attack somebody's sacred cow.
I was recently talking to a guy online about 9/11 truth, and it brought up. He was bringing up this idea of the post hoc ergo propter hoc fallacy.
Okay,
and he was saying that planes hitting buildings does not automatically mean that those buildings will fall. So he was saying that there's no causal link between the plane hitting the building and the building falling. And therefore it was an inside job. Okay. Therefore the official story is nonsense or whatever.
Convincingly argued. Well done.
Yes, very much so. I was super switched over.
Yeah.
And speaking of 9/11 truth, you were on Joe Rogan's podcast a while ago.
I was 2014. Yeah.
Yeah. I figured it was 4 or 5 years ago.
Yeah.
And I remember listening to that one. And you and Joe Rogan were going back and forth quite a bit about the idea that the one building fell into its footprint.
Building 7, yeah.
Yeah. And I mean, I obviously watched the videos and whatnot, and I felt that like Joe was way off base. But something that I said recently got me a bit of feedback where people said I was making stuff up about Joe Rogan. And did you ever get the impression that he was a 9/11 truther?
Well, he certainly used to be. He says he is no longer. And I certainly believe someone when they tell me what they do or don't believe themselves.
Right.
So I do think he has come around on that, and I think a large part of the animosity that developed as a result of that interview that we had came down to he was denying that he had ever believed any of these things. With the exception of the moon hoax, because that's been so thoroughly documented. He debated Neil deGrasse Tyson about it.
Yeah.
But as far as all the other conspiracy theories that I had said he used to promote, he simply denied that he promoted them. So I had to come back with a blog post and said, okay, here's all the references. Here is every one of Joe Rogan's shows where he said all of these different things. And, it just kind of devolved into him emailing me obscenities, and that was the end of it. So, yeah. So I'm I think officially Joe Rogan's most hated guest ever.
Well, actually, I had to kind of slowly stop listening to Joe Rogan's show after that because it just seemed like I couldn't trust what he was saying, and I think I kind of feel justified in that more and more as time has gone on, but.
Well, I got to be honest. I had not ever listened to his show more than. I mean, I knew about it, and I was aware of it, and I'd heard bits and pieces as much as anyone. But I'd never been a subscriber or sat down and listened to an entire 3-hour show.
Right.
I did a couple before I went on just to prepare, but I heard that after I was on the show, I got a lot of emails from people who had become really frustrated with him misrepresenting and rewriting his own history, claiming that he had never said this, claiming that he hadn't done this when he clearly had, that he didn't believe JFK was a conspiracy theory when he had clearly said so in earlier shows. Right. All down the line. And I think where that really went south is, like I mentioned, it's a 3-hour show.
Yeah.
And so if you go to YouTube, there is a 3-hour clip of our entire conversation, which at the time was, I mean, most of the fighting came after the show. The show itself wasn't bad. I thought it was perfectly genial and had some great conversation in it. But what they did, and I don't know who did this, but it is posted on an account that appears to be their YouTube account, is there's a 24-minute edit of the show that is completely obscenely, absurdly edited to make me look like the world's biggest jerk.
Oh, geez.
From to the point that just the first 5 seconds of it, Joe says to me, "Hey, Brian Dunning, great to have you on the show." And it cuts to me, and I just kind of smirk and roll my eyes and don't answer him.
Oh, geez.
And it cuts back to him, and he goes, "Okay, well," and that's kind of sets the tone for the whole thing.
Right.
Now, that 24-minute version has, last I checked, well over 1 million views compared to like 20,000 for the 3-hour view.
Oh, jeez.
the impression that they wanted people to be left with, I don't think was a very honest one. And that was, in large part, what's driving our science friction project, this documentary film about scientists who have had this happen to them when they go on these TV shows.
Right.
They get edited out of context to make it seem like they're trying to promote something paranormal or whatever.
Do you have, like, off the top of your head, who are some of the scientists that are going to be featured in this?
Yeah, so if you go to sciencefriction.tv, we've got a list of them. There's a bunch that we've already interviewed. I'm just starting a little section on the website called Scientist Stories, where we're kind of giving a quick version of how they were misrepresented. And just as a couple of examples, I mean, we've got some big names on there, but the people who are big names are not the ones who have had this happen to them most egregiously.
Right.
Because you can't really get away with trying to do that to Neil deGrasse Tyson or Bill Nye the Science Guy or something like that. So they typically do it to people whose names aren't household words.
Right.
So, for example, we have Jonathan Davis, who is a shark scientist, and he was featured on Shark Week. And what they did to him is they put him on the airboat and they drove him to a part of the bayou and they said, "Hey, so what do you know about the giant legendary monster shark called whatever it was called?" And he says, "I have no idea what you're talking about. Sorry." They say, "Okay, well, next question. Is it possible that any large sharks could ever be in these waters?" And he said, "Oh, yeah, for sure. Large sharks like that will come. This is where you would find them, in fact, right here." So then when the episode ran on the air, they grafted his second answer onto the first question.
Of course.
They said,
geez.
"What do you know about the legendary monster shark?" And he says, "Oh, it's right here in these waters," which absolutely 100% misrepresents not only his view, but, of course, good science.
Yeah.
And it leaves the viewers with the impression that science supports the idea that this monster shark is real and, in fact, lives right here. So that's such a perfect case of what happens to all of these scientists on all of these shows. Well, that's an exaggeration. To many of these scientists on many of these shows.
Yeah, jeez. That must be very frustrating to experience.
Oh, for sure. And it makes people gun shy, and they never want to go on these shows again.
Yeah.
I had a great conversation with Richard Wiseman, who is a experimental psychologist out of the UK. He's very popular. He's a really funny guy. And I ran into him at a conference, and I told him about our film. And I said, "Hey, has this ever happened to you? And do you maybe have a story you want to tell us in the film?" And this was so funny. I mean, he and I are friends. So, but he like grabs me and pushes me back against the wall and gets in my face. And he's pointing his finger in my face as he's telling me this. He says, "I never go on any of those shows. In fact, my university, we have a policy that if you want one of us to be on the show, here's the contract you've got to sign. And it's 25 pages long, and it gives us creative control over your documentary, and blah, 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 blah." And he says, "That's why this has never happened to me, because those are the lengths we have to go to prevent ourselves from being misrepresented." And I said to him, "Richard, that's perfect. That's exactly what I want to hear from you in the film."
Yeah, for sure.
And he said, "It's going to be the same thing for you in your film." And I say, "That's great. In fact, that's something we want to put in the credits of the film, is we want to have every scientist that we've featured just send us a little 5-second Skype video and tell us how they feel that we represented them in the film, and then have that included over the end credits."
Makes it quite a bit different than Shark Week.
Yeah. Much the opposite.
Yeah. It's quite the experience, I suppose, to just be misrepresented. There's one takedown video of against me somewhere on the internet. It's by some obscure anti-SJW YouTuber. and I just didn't even bother watching it.
Oh, you should. It could be fun.
It could be. But to be like misrepresented on an actual like television show where millions of people are viewing it would be, I don't know, a bit disheartening.
Stephen Novella had a similar experience, maybe not so egregious, when he went on Dr. Oz.
Oh, yeah.
We've already interviewed him for that. We had Richard Dawkins, Michael Shermer were on Expelled was the name of this movie, that they were told it was a different movie about something different before they agreed to do the interview.
Is that, what's his name? Ben Stein's movie?
Yes, Ben Stein's movie. And that's going back a few years now, but it was also a great example of what can happen when you're not careful.
Yeah. And that's like the actor who was, she was a Star Trek actor and did, or was it? Yeah.
Oh, so that was a different film. I think you're talking about, I'm not remembering the name of it, but it was a movie it was a documentary movie promoting geocentrism.
Yeah, that's right. Yeah.
And so they had, Captain Janeway. Someone please help me. I'm spacing on her name.
Yeah, me too.
Oh, this is so stupid. I've got it in my notes because we've been trying to reach her.
Oh, is that right?
Okay, I got to look it up. Okay. I can't leave that hanging. That's no fair to her.
Yeah.
Kate Mulgrew.
Yes.
So Kate Mulgrew played Captain Janeway in U.S. Star Trek Voyager, and they hired her to narrate this film. And she's an actress. She's not a scientist. She's a science fan, but very much in a every person on the street kind of way.
Yeah. And
I guess didn't necessarily have the expertise to discern what this film was actually about. When you're given the narration, your narration script is a tiny, tiny percentage of all the dialogue in the film.
For sure.
Most of the content comes from the people on screen who are being interviewed. So it's perfectly reasonable that she could have done this job never having any idea that she's being hired to promote some nonsense perspective.
Yeah.
And this film also took some old clips of Lawrence Krauss. They didn't even interview him, but they made it seem as if they had. They did something with Michio Kaku as well, but we haven't spoken to him yet, and I'm not familiar with his experience. But all these people reported having been taken for a ride by these documentary filmmakers.
Jeez.
And it's a terrible thing. It does a disservice to science, and it does a terrible disservice to the viewers. And so I think it deserves to be slapped down. And so I think this film is very important.
Yeah. I know I used to be a huge fan of watching documentaries, but as the more I've learned over the last 10 years or so, that since I've been involved in or learning about skepticism and science, is that you got to be really careful about what you're watching, because some of this stuff is just misinformation and they're misrepresenting scientists, and it's quite, I don't know, you got to be really careful about what you're watching.
There's almost never a documentary film that doesn't have some agenda.
Yeah.
It's tough. And often that agenda is, for example, if it's a documentary about one particular sports figure, it'll often show him in a good light and his rivals in a more negative light.
Right.
Okay. I mean, that's taking a perspective, but so many other documentaries openly promote pseudoscience and false history. And those are the ones that we're really interested in going after.
For sure. We recently covered, well, not recently, but the What the Health documentary was on Netflix. So one of our panel members watched that and reported back to us, and it was apparently quite bad.
Yeah, and a lot of these films will have pretty significant sort of social impact.
Yeah.
For example, Blackfish was a movie. Right. It's also getting kind of old. That's probably close to 10 years old now. But Blackfish was purported to be a documentary about how horrible SeaWorld is, basically, and
right.
and it was almost 100% BS from beginning to end. You can also read the scientists who were portrayed in that. They've written some blogs and stuff like that about their experience trying to clear the record. But if you go on Facebook, you'll still to this day see your friends singing the praises of Blackfish and how it finally had the courage to reveal this horrible story. And that's the kind of thing that the power that documentary films have, because as a documentary, people tend to trust them.
Yeah.
And yet they're no more likely than pure fiction to be truthful.
Yeah, it's like you add, like reading a book that's nonfiction, you assume nonfiction to be true, but that doesn't make it true.
Yeah, that's you have the same factor with nonfiction books. There's just as many books in the library on Holocaust denial as there are on true history of World War II.
Right, and nobody's sticking them in the fiction section.
Yeah,
that's probably a good place to end it, though. Do you want to maybe plug your stuff again, or give a few links?
Yeah, so Conspiracies Declassified is the book. It's available as a print book or an ebook. I don't know if they have plans to produce it as an audiobook, but you can buy it at any bookstore, anywhere books are sold, or online, Amazon, Barnes & Noble, the bookstore of your choice. Please check it out from Adams Media, a Simon & Schuster imprint. It's a great book. We had a lot of fun writing and editing it and putting it together, and I really hope that people enjoy it, and it's something that you can share with your conspiracy theory-minded friends, more importantly. So, Conspiracies Declassified by me, Brian Dunning.
Perfect. What I will actually do is, and I try to do this with most of the authors that we have on here, is that I will buy a copy for the first person to email me and say that they want a copy. So
Very
if
cool.
Somebody emails me at mail@brainstormblog.net, then I will send them. I will order them a copy of the book.
That is very awesome. That is very awesome. I like that.
So I guess that's it. Thanks for joining me.
Okay, thank you for having me on. A lot of fun to talk about this stuff. It's my favorite subject, so
Right on.
always fun.
So that's it for the interview. I want to thank Brian for chatting with me. We didn't go too deep into things, but it was still really cool to help him promote his new book and to hear about his video series. Like I said in the interview, I will order a copy for the first person who sends me an email saying they want a copy of the book. Email me at mail@brainstormblog.net. Before I close out this episode, I want to thank Jamie Anthrope for leaving us a 5-star review on our Facebook page. She also said, I thoroughly enjoyed my first Brainstorm podcast tonight. Thanks for singing the Gummy Bears theme song for me. I look forward to when the podcast season returns. So, I mean, a little bit of background. That was from the June 22nd live show, and you can listen to the last episode of the Shift to Reason Radio, the episode of Brainstorm before this, where Lisa sings the Gummy Bears theme song. What else? Oh yeah, we got a couple new patrons. Big thanks to Keith Davies and Kim Bodkovsky. I'm terribly sorry if I said your name wrong. You will hear their names along with all our other patrons every week in the closing segment. As usual, I want to give a special thanks to our top patrons: Bassett, Destin Doesn't Suck That Much, Daryl, Aaron, William, and Positively Skeptical. For everything else, you can check out the show notes at thebrainstormpodcast.com and our website, brainstormblog.net. Thanks to everybody who supports us financially: Keith, Kim, Janet, Stephanie, Zach, the Utah Outcasts, Bassett, Will, Aaron, Daryl, Destin Sucks, Bob Glenn, Destin Doesn't Suck That Much, Magnus, several species of small furry animals gathered together in a cave, Positively Skeptical, Rob, Chris, and Larry. If you want to join them and help the show grow, then you can do that at patreon.com/brainstormpodcast. Or you can go buy some stuff that also supports the show. It's tpublic.com/stores/brainstorm-podcast-gear. Thanks to Dave for our intro music. Thank you to Aaron Rabbi from the Embrace the Void podcast for doing the intro voiceover. You can find his stuff at voidpod.com. Thanks to Alex Capper Murdoch for doing the voiceover for our ads, and thanks to Jason Camo for our outro music. You can find his stuff at aloststateofmind.com. All the music played is either with permission or under the SOCAN license to play. For more information on SOCAN, you can check out the music license info page on our website, brainstormblog.net. Remember to give us a rating, a thumbs up, or a fave on your podcatcher of choice. Join our Facebook group, like our page, follow us on Twitter, share the show, and spread the word. Thanks for listening, and remember, the truth matters.
This is an opinion-based podcast. Each person on the podcast is responsible for their own opinions, and those opinions don't necessarily reflect the views of the rest of the panel. Any guests or anyone associated with the people on the podcast, such as spouses, partners, children, other family members, friends, or employers. No one person speaks for the podcast with the possible exception of Cory, and he doesn't speak for anyone else on the show. The Brainstorm podcast does not represent the views of our sponsors.
We just wanted to say thanks to everyone who listens to us, shares the show, gives us a rating on iTunes or Stitcher, or supports us through Patreon and Gumroad. We don't have a lot of interactions with our listeners, but what we have had proves that we attract some of the best people around. Smart, kind, and cool. An audience truly worthy of the titles hardcore and woo-free. Thanks for helping us make the world a smarter place.